My mother-in-law nearly killed my daughter by ignoring her allergies, just to prove I was a negligent mom. Then she cried victim when I cut ties. The silence in the pediatric ICU was the kind that pressed against your eardrums like deep water. I sat beside Emma's hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her small chest, the IV line snaking into her arm like a translucent lifeline. The antiseptic smell couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of fear that seemed to permeate these walls. A mixture of desperate hope and barely contained panic that I'd never noticed before becoming part of it. My phone buzzed for the dozenth time. Margaret's name flashed across the screen, accompanied by another lengthy text that I deleted without reading. The others had been variations of the same theme. I'm so sorry asterisk. I never meant asterisk. Please forgive me asterisk. Family is everything. Each message felt like salt in a wound that was still too fresh to properly comprehend. Dr. Patel entered with that careful quietness that medical professionals perfect, present but not intrusive, authoritative yet gentle. The swelling is continuing to decrease, she said, checking Emma's chart on her tablet. Her oxygen levels have been stable all night. We're looking at another day or two of monitoring, but I'm optimistic. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Optimistic. Such a clinical word for the overwhelming relief that made my hands shake. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Patel continued, her dark eyes studying my face. I need to ask again about the exposure. You're certain about the timeline? The timeline. As if the last 48 hours could be reduced to a neat sequence of events, cause and effect laid out like evidence in a courtroom. She was fine when I dropped her off at her grandmother's house on Friday afternoon. Margaret called me at work around 3 on Saturday, said Emma wasn't feeling well. By the time I got there, I swallowed hard. She could barely breathe. What I didn't say, what I couldn't quite bring myself to voice aloud yet, was that Margaret had waited. Had watched my 5-year-old daughter's lips turn blue, had seen her struggle for air, and had waited nearly an hour before making that phone call. Not because she didn't understand the severity, not because she panicked or forgot, but because she wanted to prove a point. Dr. Patel made a note. The good news is that Emma's response to treatment has been excellent. Children are remarkably resilient. She paused. But I have to stress again how critical it is that everyone in her care understands the severity of her allergies. Tree nuts aren't something to experiment with. Experiment. Another clinical term that couldn't capture the magnitude of what had actually happened. After Dr. Patel left, I returned to my vigil, studying Emma's face in the dim light filtering through the blinds. She looked so small against the white hospital bedding, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. 5 years old, and she'd already learned that the people who claimed to love her most could be the ones who hurt her deepest. My phone rang, not a text this time, but an actual call. Margaret's contact photo filled the screen. A smiling woman in her 60s with perfectly styled silver hair and the kind of pearl earrings that suggested old money and older opinions. I'd taken that photo last Christmas, back when I still believed her criticisms came from a place of genuine concern rather than calculated malice. I declined the call. The truth was, I'd been collecting evidence for months without realizing it. Little moments that seemed insignificant in isolation but formed a pattern when viewed together. The way Margaret's face would tighten almost imperceptibly when Emma called me Mama, instead of the mother she preferred. How she'd always managed to have Emma dressed in completely different clothes when I picked her up, as if my clothing choices were somehow inadequate. The gentle corrections that weren't quite gentle enough. Oh, Emma, you don't really need to hold Mama's hand crossing the parking lot, do you? Big girls walk by themselves. But it was more subtle than outright criticism. Margaret had perfected the art of the concerned suggestion, the helpful observation that left you questioning your own judgment. I noticed Emma seems tired lately. Are you sure she's getting enough sleep? She mentioned being hungry after school. Maybe pack an extra snack? Her teacher said something about her being distracted in class. Everything okay at home? Each comment was reasonable in isolation, the kind of thing a caring grandmother might say. But together, they formed a steady drumbeat of inadequacy, a constant suggestion that I wasn't quite meeting the mark as a mother. I should have seen it sooner. Should have recognized the way she'd volunteered to babysit, then casually mention how much better Emma behaved for her. How she'd teach Emma little songs or games, then express surprise that I hadn't already taught them myself. Oh, she didn't know how to tie her shoes yet? Well, we'll just practice together. The allergies, though, that should have been sacred ground. Emma had been diagnosed with severe tree nut allergies when she was 3, after a terrifying incident with a granola bar that sent us to the emergency room for the first time. Since then, I'd been militant about reading labels, calling restaurants ahead of time, carrying EpiPens like other people carried car keys. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Margaret knew this, had been present for the doctor's explanations, had watched me demonstrate how to use the EpiPen, had nodded seriously when I explained that even trace amounts could trigger a reaction. She'd seemed to understand the gravity of it, had even gone so far as to clear her pantry of anything containing nuts and to buy a separate EpiPen to keep at her house. Which made what happened next so much worse. The first incident was small enough that I almost dismissed it. Emma came home from Margaret's with hives on her arms, claiming her grandmother had given her special cookies. When I called to ask about it, Margaret seemed genuinely confused. They were from the bakery section at Whole Foods. I checked the ingredients, but when I went to the store and found the same cookies, the label clearly listed almonds in the ingredient list. She must have grabbed the wrong package, David said when I told him about it that evening. My husband had inherited his mother's gift for reasonable explanations that somehow made you feel unreasonable for questioning them. You know how tiny that print is. And she called you right away when Emma started reacting. She had called, had given Emma Benadryl and monitored her carefully until I arrived, had apologized profusely and thrown away the remaining cookies with what seemed like genuine remorse. It was easy to believe it was an honest mistake. The second incident was harder to explain away. Emma came home from an overnight stay at Margaret's with her face swollen and her breathing slightly labored. This time, the culprit was a trail mix that Margaret claimed had been, accidentally, mixed in with the regular snacks during a playdate with Emma's cousin. I turned my back for 2 minutes, she'd explained, her voice shaking with what I'd interpreted as guilt and fear. You know how quickly children can get into things. But something about the timing felt off. Emma's cousin lived 3 hours away and rarely visited. The playdate had been Margaret's idea, suggested seemingly out of nowhere during a casual phone call the week before. And when I asked Emma about it later, her description of events didn't quite match her grandmother's story. Grandma Margaret said the nuts were good for me, Emma had whispered when I was tucking her into bed. She said they'd make me strong like Cousin Jake. When I confronted Margaret about this, her response was swift and smooth. You know how children mix up conversations. I was probably talking about how nuts are generally healthy, not specifically for Emma. She must have misunderstood. Again, reasonable. Again, delivered with just enough concern for Emma's tendency to misremember things that I found myself doubting my own daughter's account rather than Margaret's. David was less willing to dismiss it this time, but still clung to the benefit of the doubt like a life preserver. Maybe we need to be clearer with her about the allergies. Write everything down, make it foolproof. So I did. I created detailed instruction sheets, laminated them, posted them on Margaret's refrigerator. I bought special containers for Emma's safe foods and labeled them with bright stickers. I even made a photo chart showing common products that contained tree nuts, thinking maybe the issue was Margaret's failing eyesight or memory. Margaret received all of this with gracious appreciation, thanking me for being so thorough, so organized. You're such a good mother, she'd said, in that tone that somehow made it sound like an accusation. So careful about everything. The third incident happened last weekend, and there was nothing accidental about it. I dropped Emma off on Friday afternoon for what was supposed to be a fun grandmother-granddaughter weekend. Margaret had planned a trip to the Children's Museum, maybe some shopping, definitely some spoiling in the way that grandmothers are supposed to do. Emma had been excited, chattering about all the things she and Grandma Margaret might do together. When Margaret called on Saturday afternoon, her voice was different. Not panicked, not guilty, almost clinical. Emma's having some trouble breathing. You might want to come over. The drive to Margaret's house normally took 20 minutes. I made it in 12, my heart hammering against my ribs the entire way. I found Emma on the living room couch, her face flushed and swollen, her breathing rapid and shallow. Margaret was sitting beside her, checking her watch. When did this start? I asked, already reaching for the EpiPen in Emma's emergency bag. About an hour ago, Margaret said calmly. Maybe a little more. An hour. She'd watched my daughter struggle to breathe for over an hour without calling 911, without administering the EpiPen, without even calling me immediately. What did she eat? I was already injecting the epinephrine as I spoke, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind tried to process what I was seeing. Just some homemade cookies, Margaret replied. I made them myself, so I knew exactly what was in them. The cookies were still on the kitchen counter, arranged on Margaret's good china plate like an offering. When I grabbed one and scanned the ingredients I'd seen her use, everything looked safe. Flour, sugar, butter, eggs, vanilla. Nothing that should have triggered Emma's allergies. It wasn't until we were in the ambulance, with Emma's breathing finally starting to stabilize, that I thought to look more carefully at the trash. There, crumpled at the bottom of the kitchen wastebasket, was an empty bag of almond flour. She'd substituted almond flour for regular flour. Had deliberately baked cookies using one of the very ingredients that could kill my daughter, then fed them to her and waited to see what would happen. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't negligence or confusion or an honest mistake. This was calculated, intentional. Margaret had poisoned my daughter to prove a point. But what point? That I was overprotective? That Emma's allergies were somehow exaggerated or psychosomatic? That I was using them to control or manipulate the family dynamic? Over the next 24 hours, as Emma fought her way through the worst allergic reaction she'd ever experienced, the pieces began to fall into place. The pattern of accidents that always seemed to happen when Emma was alone with Margaret. The subtle undermining of my parenting decisions, the constant suggestions that I was somehow not quite adequate. The way Margaret had positioned herself as the reasonable, loving grandmother being kept at arm's length by an over-anxious, controlling daughter-in-law. She'd been building a case against me, incident by incident, comment by comment. And Emma's allergies, the very thing I was most vigilant about protecting, had become her weapon of choice. The calls and texts from Margaret started before we'd even left the hospital. Apologies mixed with explanations, remorse tangled with justification. She'd made a mistake, she said. Had gotten confused about which flower she'd grabbed. Was devastated that Emma had been hurt. Would never forgive herself. But buried in the lengthy messages were other things too. Suggestions that maybe this was a sign Emma's allergies were getting worse because I wasn't managing them properly. Observations that perhaps Emma needed to see a specialist, get more testing, try a different approach. Always with that same undertone of loving concern that made you question your own perceptions. David arrived at the hospital Sunday morning looking haggard and confused. His mother had called him, crying, explaining that there'd been a terrible accident, that Emma was in the hospital, that she was beside herself with guilt. She'd painted a picture of a grandmother who'd made an innocent mistake and was now being blamed for something beyond her control. She's devastated, he told me, settling into the chair beside Emma's bed. She wants to come see Emma, to apologize in person. No. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, causing Emma to stir slightly in her sleep. Sarah, I know you're upset, but she's family. She loves Emma. This was an accident. It wasn't an accident. I kept my voice low, but the words carried the weight of absolute certainty. She used almond flour, David. Deliberately. I found the bag in her trash. I watched my husband's face as he processed this information. Saw the moment when reasonable explanations started to crumble, when the benefit of the doubt became impossible to maintain. That doesn't make sense, he said finally. Why would she do that? Why indeed? To prove that I was overprotective? To demonstrate that Emma's allergies weren't as severe as I claimed? To position herself as the victim of an unreasonable daughter-in-law who was keeping her from her beloved granddaughter? Or maybe just because she could. Because she'd found a way to hurt me that looked like love, to undermine me in a way that seemed like caring concern. She's been testing the boundaries, I said, thinking out loud. The first 2 incidents were trial runs. She wanted to see how far she could push before someone noticed the pattern. David was quiet for a long time, staring at Emma's sleeping form. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She could have killed her. Yes, she could have. And some part of me wondered if that might have been acceptable collateral damage in whatever game Margaret had been playing. A way to prove definitively that I was a negligent mother who couldn't even keep her own child safe. The irony was devastating. In her effort to demonstrate my inadequacy as a parent, Margaret had created the very situation she'd been warning everyone about. Emma was in the hospital not because I'd failed to protect her, but because the person I'd trusted to help me protect her had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. My phone buzzed with another message. This time, I read it. Sarah, please. We need to talk about this as a family. Emma needs her grandmother. David needs his mother. This kind of division helps no one. I made a mistake, but cutting me out of Emma's life hurts her more than it hurts me. Think about what's best for everyone, not just your own feelings. Asterisk. Even now, even after everything, she was doing it. Positioning herself as the reasonable one, the one thinking about family harmony and Emma's best interests. Making my decision to protect my daughter sound selfish and vindictive. But I was done being reasonable. Done giving her the benefit of the doubt. Done pretending that love and manipulation could coexist in the same relationship without one eventually consuming the other. I deleted the message and blocked her number. When Emma woke up an hour later, her first words were, "Is Grandma Margaret coming to visit?" I smoothed her hair back from her forehead, choosing my words carefully. "Grandma Margaret won't be visiting for a while, sweetheart. But Daddy and I are here, and you're safe." She nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 5-year-old understanding of the world. Maybe it did. Maybe children are better at recognizing when someone's love comes with conditions, when care is contingent on compliance. "The cookies tasted funny," she whispered. "But Grandma Margaret said they were good for me." And there it was. The final piece of evidence I needed, delivered in my daughter's small, trusting voice. Margaret had known exactly what she was doing. Had watched Emma eat the cookies, had probably encouraged her to finish them, had waited to see how severe the reaction would be before deciding whether to call for help. David took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen it sooner. We both should have." But Margaret had been so careful, so methodical in her approach. She'd understood that the most effective way to undermine someone wasn't through direct confrontation, but through 1,000 small cuts that made you question your own perceptions. She'd gambled that her relationship with David, her position as the loving grandmother, her reputation as a pillar of the community would protect her from any serious consequences. That even if I suspected what she was doing, I wouldn't be able to prove it, wouldn't be willing to risk the family upheaval that would come with accusations. She'd been wrong. As I sat in that hospital room, watching my daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in days, I felt something shift inside me. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that, but a kind of clarity I hadn't experienced before. The weight of trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the accommodating wife, the reasonable woman who always gave everyone the benefit of the doubt, lifted from my shoulders like a physical burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Margaret had shown me exactly who she was. Finally, definitively, without room for doubt or alternative explanations. And in doing so, she'd freed me from the obligation to pretend otherwise. Emma was going to be okay. She was strong and resilient, and she had parents who would move heaven and earth to protect her. But she would grow up knowing that love without trust is just another form of control, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who use your vulnerability against you. The afternoon sun slanted through the hospital blinds, casting geometric patterns across the floor. Somewhere across town, Margaret was probably composing another message, crafting another explanation, building another bridge I had no intention of crossing. But here, in this quiet room filled with the steady rhythm of machines keeping watch over my daughter's recovery, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. The kind that comes not from avoiding conflict, but from finally having the courage to name it for what it is. Trust, once broken in such a fundamental way, couldn't be repaired with apologies or explanations. Some betrayals were too deep, too calculated, too dangerous to forgive. And recognizing that wasn't cruel or vindictive, it was simply the truth, sharp and clean and undeniable. Emma stirred in her sleep, her breathing deep and steady. Safe. Finally, completely safe. And that was all that mattered.